welcome to Freethought in Florida. I'm your host, Sarah Ray. This is the 13th of September. We are almost to Free Flow. We're going to talk about Free Flow a little bit today. But first, Freethought in Florida is a production of the Atheist community of Polk County, a Florida nonprofit organization. And joining me for this episode is Monica Miller, legal director and senior counsel with the American Humanist Association. I don't know that we've announced this on Freethought in Florida yet, but I will be serving as the MC for Free Flow this year, which is the Freethought Florida Conference in Orlando in November, and I have to practice that because I say Florida Freethought Conference every single time, and it's Freethought Florida Conference. Free Flow. Come to Free Flow. And Monica is one of our speakers at this year's conference, so this was a really great opportunity to get some interviews scheduled and do a little cross-promotion with Free Flow. Now, if the name Monica Miller rings a bell, you may have seen her on national or local TV or radio, and her work arguing church-state separation cases, including earlier this year presenting oral argument before the Supreme Court in American Legion v. American Humanist Association, a.k.a. the Bladensburg Cross case. Monica, thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I have been so looking forward to chatting with you, and I'm really excited for Free Flow, both here in our local group and on the sort of side personal podcast that I do. Mm-hmm. We cover a lot of legal stories in the church-state separation world, so this is really exciting.
Yeah.
So we'll talk a little bit more about Free Flow in a little bit, but I want to ask the most pressing question in all of our minds. You've been in front of the Supreme Court recently. Just how is Ruth Bader Ginsburg? Is she good? She all right?
She's amazing. That was the most surreal aspect of the whole day. I mean, I was, sitting there. I was less nervous than I thought I would be, and then when the justices came in and she sits down, I just had to look away because I was just so both awestruck and starstruck at the same time. And I had seen her before in oral arguments, not for my case, but for another case, just to observe arguments. And even then I was impressed. But then when I started processing, oh my gosh, I might be speaking with her and she knows who I am now. It was, very surreal. And she is just an amazing woman, wrote an amazing dissent in our case.
Awesome. Well, I'll get here in a minute. We have a Ruth Bader Ginsburg action figure that I'll get down and we can play with that. We typically keep our Ruth Bader Ginsburg safely wrapped up in bubble wrap just in case.
Yeah.
I don't believe in superstitions or any of that kind of stuff, but just in case.
Just in case.
Yeah.
I get that.
that. Okay, so let's talk about you then. I'm really curious about your story and how you sort of became this prominent defender of the church-state wall, so to speak. Were you raised in a particular belief?
I mean, yes and no. My family is pretty agnostic, but I did go to Catholic school for 10 years in California, so it was kind of a progressive state. In fact, even in my Catholic school, I think a fifth of our class was maybe Jewish or some other religion. But it still forced me to sort of confront religious issues and a religion that was very, top down and we set the rules and you don't ask why kind of thing. I mean, just the Catholic school concept in general is very much like that. And my brain is not like that. And so they'd say you can't wear, any earring that goes below your earlobe. And I would come wearing giant hoops and just try to push the boundaries of the religion stuff a little bit. So my parents weren't Catholic, but they thought it was a nice school, and it was. And then, I just, through high school, I realized more that I was at least very skeptical of religion. And then by the time I hit college, I was definitely I definitely don't believe in God. It's not, that's just not my belief. But I also became more cognizant of the issues surrounding sort of the dangers of when government and religion intertwine, and both in our country and in other countries. And I took actually the first ever course in called Sociology of Secularism, taught by Phil Zuckerman. and it was his first time teaching that course, but he introduced us to all these books, sort of not just like atheism is this, non-belief, but kind of like, humanism and activism, and sort of introduced me to the different branches. So by the time I hit law school, which I was already planning to go to to pursue my interest in animal rights, I also took on the issue of church-state separation.
That description of the earrings, sort of the rules of religious school. I worked for Walt Disney for almost
Oh,
10 years.
yeah,
The Walt Disney Company, not the man.
right.
And their grooming guidelines are very much a sort of 1940s. That's what
Yeah,
that reminded me of. Men
yeah,
can't wear earrings at all, and ladies'
right.
earrings have to be between this size and this size, and
And of
uh,
course, the skirt, like we had the uniform, so it was like all of us
yeah.
teenager or preteens, I guess, would be rolling up our skirts, and then they would, nuns would come around and take out their rulers. I mean, it was really old school, even though I was just growing up in like the 80s, 90s. So it's like it was,
Yeah.
yeah.
So it doesn't sound then like your family is particularly like overly religious.
No, no, not at all. I mean, we didn't go to church. My mom, we have like a cute little church up the street. And I think my mom tried to get us to go once, and then I think she thought it was too, like doctrinal. And I think she just, I think it was that innocent of wanting your kids to have values. But at that time, certainly she didn't know about humanism. And, it was just like, again, this is California religion. So everything is sort of this watered down. We all love each other. We're not fighting, but Jesus. So it just didn't. There wasn't really a need for it, I guess you could say.
Right. Well, and I was curious because, so many people are sort of, I mean, more and more people are coming out of religion and coming out openly about being non-theistic and struggling with religious family and sort of their outspokenness and
Yeah.
activist work. So yeah, so that was something that kind of trips my mind when I think about someone who has become such a sort of public figure, I guess, in the sphere of this world the work that we do. But it doesn't sound like you have issues of family, concerned about the work that you're doing. That would have been where my mind went for the worst.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that they have zero concerns. I mean, their concerns surround actually being very aware of how dangerous the religious right is and people that
That's
don't
good.
appreciate our work. So they're more scared on that front than they are me expressing, or representing people who are in communities. We have plenty of clients that we've represented who are in those types of families who, that don't accept them for coming out as an atheist or not humanist or non-believer, and being in those communities. So they're afraid for my safety, but
Yeah.
not for my, my afterlife.
Right. So then the work that you do today, you did kind of mention that you got into a legal track with a passion around animal rights, and
Hmm.
then that sort of led you into this realm.
Hmm.
Was this something that was always sort of on the table, or was there a moment that it just sort of came to you like this is something I should be doing with my life?
I guess a moment is I can't pinpoint a single moment, but what I can say is that animal rights has been something that's always been important to me, like since I was a kid. I mean, maybe I didn't have an early conception of rights, but I declared I wanted to be vegetarian, by third grade, and that kind of thing. And I've always been interested more in like the rights aspect, sort of the legal side, than just welfare. I mean, welfare is incredibly important, but I felt like it's not enough to say, a pig should have a pen that's this large. I say the pig should be free.
Right.
Um, but like I realized, and I have a lot of other progressive causes, obviously, feminism, LGBT rights, like all of these progressive causes I felt were important to push forward with. I felt like the religious right and the way that, the government is promoting religion and infringing on other people's rights because of religious beliefs was kind of like the barrier to progress, if that makes sense. So to me,
Yeah.
working on church state separation was almost like I need to do that first before. And to be clear, I'm actually still working for an animal rights group,
Right.
the Non-Human Rights Project. So I'm doing both, but I felt like how can we get progress on these other fronts when we're not fighting back on like the kind of fundamental First Amendment freedoms?
You're absolutely right. It's funny because when we decided to start this local nonprofit community group, um, I had dabbled a little bit in organizing for the trans community.
Hmm.
Um, we live in Polk County is a pretty rural area. We vote red most of the time, and church on every corner kind of place.
Right.
And so initially, as I came out as trans and sort of started seeing how trans people are treated in general, I have had a very privileged experience, I'm happy to say, but I
Yeah.
know I know that then I have to use that, right? Um, so I sort of dabbled in it a little bit and thought, oh, we should get some peer support groups started up and other things like that. And and very much the same when my wife and I do this podcast, this personal podcast, where we started out talking about this is my story and this is what it's like to be a trans person in this time and place, and this is what it's like to go to work and have to tell your HR that, hey, there's some changes you need to know about that are coming, and what's it like to go to those doctor's appointments and the
Hmm.
therapy and all of that stuff. um, and then we started reading news stories, and we wanted it to be very sort of LGBTQ centric.
Right.
But all the news stories that we were seeing were so often, here's another case of religious bigotry infringing upon the
Right.
LGBT community. And so then
Right.
and then Trump got elected, and then we just became a very activist-y sort of political show instead
Yeah.
of our personal little
Because
storytelling
it's like you
thing.
kind of have to do the basic thing. Like you have to kind of
Yeah.
like, how do you even have that discussion about doctor's appointments when like you might not even have the right to like be who
Go.
you are,
Yeah.
you know?
Yep.
It's,
Yeah. So I realized sort of the same that if I were to be an atheist organizer and do work in that space, that I can probably actually do even more for my community, my LGBT community, sort of through that than just organizing separately for them. So that's
totally.
interesting.
They're all related. Everything in my mind, especially when you kind of go under the humanism umbrella, because it's not just non-belief, but it is all these sort of affirmative progressive values, like that the world is a place we need to take care of and we need to work, solve the world's problems. When you sort of approach things from that humanistic outlook, you see that you can't really separate one from the other. They're all kind of part of this need to push forward.
Absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit about invocations and monuments
Mm-hmm.
in a minute, but before we get into sort of that, what other sort of church state issues do you and your team at the Humanist Legal Center tend to find yourselves getting involved in?
It's a whole range. You nailed two of perhaps the bigger ones lately, but school prayer, graduation prayers, sort of everything that happens at school. Sometimes there's Bible study
Yeah.
meetings that happen before school, but they're being endorsed by principals, or you'll have prayers by coaches, either like prayer huddles or different sort of
Mm-hmm.
iterations of that. Public schools just have all sorts of issues. Then you've got,
Oh, we know.
uh,
We have,
you know,
not to interrupt you, but
oh yeah,
just this year, this past graduation, we contacted our school board and superintendent over both prayers at graduations and during the graduation practice sessions. They had someone handing out Gideon Bibles as the kids crossed the stage and came down the steps, and there was a strange man whom they'd never met before. No, congratulations, here's your book. Like, and
yeah,
they had been notified twice
good.
in previous years by the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and yet we're still doing it despite it also being against the school board's own written policies.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've got our work cut out for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's just they push and they push and they push, and like that's what
Hmm.
we're finding, especially kind of in this new administration. I guess not new anymore, but
Yeah.
these current times that religious rights very emboldened. They have infinite resources, and so they kind of come into school districts and say, "Hey, we have a right to distribute Gideon Bibles," and they'll cite some cases that don't even apply. Totally not the law, but
Hmm.
the school districts go, "Sure, we want Gideon Bibles." So it's like they're just pushing and pushing, and like sort of like baiting us to sue. And, now we've got judges in these courts that have been appointed by Trump. So
Yep.
it's this kind of like, yeah, it's not good times for church state separation for
Yeah.
sure. But we are continuing to fight tirelessly. See, I'm so tired, I can't even talk, on doing everything we possibly can to continue to keep that wall of separation of church and state high, because it's recent times are just showing why it's so important.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Free Flow a bit then. The Freethought Florida Conference is a 3-day event put on by the Florida Humanist Association, and speakers this year include some local leaders and thinkers in the Freethought and secular community, people like Brandon Hott, Dr. Ryan Cragen, Gina Duncan, and others, and some of the fairly big names in atheism. We've got Seth Andrews, Matt Dillahunty, Aaron Ra, as well as some representatives from some of the important national organizations that are doing work in this church-state separation space, like yourself. So you're going to be talking, if I'm not mistaken, about the Bladensburg Cross case. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
Now, I followed that case pretty closely. I'm kind of a wonk in that way, a little nerdy. And I hope a lot of people did too. But obviously, like, let's not relitigate that here, right? Because that's the topic of your presentation. So I think we can tee it up pretty well, though, by instead talking about a couple of seemingly unrelated cases here in Florida. And let's start with Williamson v. Brevard County. That's our friend and mentor, David Williamson, of the Central Florida Freethought community. And he and Jocelyn are instrumental in putting on Free Flow every year. But this case centered around legislative prayer, and I interviewed David earlier this year on the other show that I host. And we talked about this, where Brevard County's Board of Commissioners was being discriminatory in selecting people to provide invocations. Walk us through this one a little bit. The American Humanist Association was involved in this case too, right?
So we weren't lead counsel. We did file an amicus brief, friend of the court brief. And this was at a time where there was 3 legislative prayer cases going on. So we also filed an amicus brief to support our friends in an FFRF's case in Barker versus, forgetting the defendant's specific name, but I think it was Speaker of the House. But yeah, so there's like 3 of these cases going on, but I do know like the core facts of Williamson's case and sort of the outcome and why it's important. So I can kind of walk you through that part. But I wasn't counsel of record in that case.
Right. So I mean, that was a pretty positive result considering the judicial climate of courts right now. So yeah, go ahead and just set up maybe just some of the basic facts of that.
Right, and so I mean, as I understand it, well, maybe I could start with sort of more of like the legal principles. The Town of Greece case came down, and it basically said that it upheld legislative prayer, this idea that local governments can have prayer before their meetings. But it said that, if it does so, it has to be non-discriminatory. It has to be a neutral practice. It has to be something where the government's not like authoring the prayers or suggesting what people say or do, and the government shouldn't be involved and so forth. And there was language in the decision that also basically said that in line with not being discriminatory, it has to be an all-comers policy, and even atheists, at least in the Town of Greece case, even atheists could deliver an invocation. And that's consistent with the Supreme Court's like long-settled rule that the government can't discriminate amongst, believers and non-believers. Right. So that's a consistent, that actually harmonizes what was previously a case that didn't have that language in it with sort of the longer-standing doctrine. So as I understand it, David wanted to deliver a non-theistic, humanistic sort of invocation, and somewhere down the line was basically told not to. I think there was some delay, some feet dragging, and I don't remember exactly what the final determination was. But I do remember the lower court said that was unconstitutional to deny humanists or non-theists the opportunity to deliver an invocation at a local government meeting when the opportunity is presented to other faith groups. And I think the government must have appealed that to the 11th Circuit, and then the 11th Circuit, I believe, affirmed most of that ruling. I think there was some caveats to it, and I'm sorry that I don't remember all the specifics. My brain's been jumbled with all of our cases right now, but as far as what we would have expected from the 11th Circuit, being a very conservative court, the ruling was better than what we've seen in other circuits.
Yeah, and I know this is something that the Central Florida Freethought community does a lot of work around. They've been dealing with discriminatory practices in Winter Garden for a number of years as well, as they keep sort of moving the goalpost around where we're going to have to have an invocation, but we're going to have the council people deliver it, the commissioners deliver it. Well, okay, now we're not going to do that anymore. Now we're going to have invited speakers, but your name has to be on the list.
Right.
Okay, well, now we're going to do that, and your name has to be on the list, but in order to get your name on the list, you have to be part of a 501c3 organization, and it just keeps moving this bar higher and higher and higher that makes it harder for people to get involved in.
Right. And I mean, those efforts, we are tracking them. I think we've been sent a warning letter. I mean, we've sent so many warning letters in Florida, to be honest, that it's like I've lost count. That sounds familiar. The Winter Garden one sounds very familiar. But no, it is exactly what they do. They move the ball around, and at a certain point, there is a very obvious case for pretext. I mean, we know it's pretext the first time they're like, oh, actually, we're going to switch it to this. But in the courts, you need there's a lot more evidence to show they are bending over backwards and jumping through hoops to make it so atheists and humanists can't deliver invocations, and that's a problem.
Yep.
So the number of times that happens, it actually ultimately can end up producing a stronger lawsuit.
Now, there's a sort of conflicting opinion that we hear in our community. This came up. Well, Joseph Richardson from the CFFC delivered a secular invocation here in Polk County at the Board of Commissioners earlier this year, and we had people amongst us who sort of have the, well, why do we even want to give invocations anyway? And my response is, we don't. I would much rather, let's do away with that. If you want to, if you're a commissioner or a council person or a legislator and you need to say some words before you go to work, do that in private chambers, and then come out, sit behind the dais, and do your job. Let's get right to work.
Right.
But perhaps what these people might actually be asking is sort of understanding where we are in the current situation with the court's position. Is demanding this equal access and representation effective at all in that sort of long-term goal of maybe reviewing Marsh and Greece in getting rid of invocations? Like, is this sort of the working within the system argument, right? Does that float? If the idea is we want a separation of church and state by us being involved in the process, does that sort of speak out of both sides of our mouth? What do you think of that?
I totally know what you're saying. And I mean, I've struggled with it a little bit. And I think, people are coming at it from different angles. I think that after Town of Greece, after we made, all of our groups got together, wrote this fantastic brief, to the Supreme Court explaining why, and it was very non-denominational. I mean, we had multi-faith groups on our briefs and stuff, and there was a lot of groups saying why legislative prayer shouldn't happen. This was the opportunity for the Supreme Court to sort of do away with Marsh, realize it was a bad ruling, didn't have any basis in the Constitution, and so forth. And because of the way the ruling went, it kind of felt like we're throwing our hands up, like it felt like we are not going to overturn this anytime soon. And so if you are going to operate a policy like this, we might as well at least not be these excluded sort of pariahs from these communities, and at least let us give our non-theistic take. So that's one perspective. Another perspective is yes, it is consistent with the goal, especially when you have the David Suhors. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but sort of the satanic approach, which is coming from an earnest and genuine, like that is how they are going to address, whatever.
Right.
When the Satanists get involved, as we know, it scares the bejesus out of Christians, and they might rethink their, is this what we want? And it's not to say that they're not entering those like all-comers policies from any perspective other than this is our faith system, but it allows you to sort of put a mirror up to Christians and say, well, this is what it feels like when you're not in that belief to be having something thrown down your throat. So I think it just depends kind of how you see it, but I do think that the more diverse those practices are, the more other people can see maybe how they're inappropriate. Because if you're a Christian and you have to sit there and listen to an Islamic prayer before you're about to address them about a parking issue or whatever, it's kind of unnecessary. And maybe it allows more people to see that. I don't know. My job again as a lawyer is kind of just to look at the law and figure out the best legal arguments. But from a public policy standpoint, it is absolutely something that I've thought about too. Is this helping us push the needle closer towards overruling March and Greece, or is this just making it sort of like, more watered down to a point where when that challenge happens, well, everyone's allowed to do it, so what's the problem?
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of go back and forth, but I tend to fall down on the side of demonstrating what that feels like to the rest of us when 98% of the invocations are Christian.
Yeah.
I tend to fall on that side, but okay, so then we'll kind of try to click through this one a little quickly. There's another case that we've been following about a giant cross in Pensacola, which the 11th Circuit ordered removed, but as you predicted, is now going back to the 11th to be reconsidered in light of the Bladensburg cross ruling.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit about that one, because as a non-lawyer, I would interpret these crosses, the facts in these cases, to be very, very different.
Yes. And they are. And that is basically what we wrote. So the 11th Circuit asked us to write a brief explaining the impact of the ruling, of the Bladensburg ruling. And I think I filed that last week. But the difference isn't just, like a little fact here, a little fact here, one's bigger, one's smaller. It's the fact of why they were put up sort of in the first place and how they're being used. The Bladensburg Cross is a 100-year-old World War I monument that's been consistently used for veteran services. Now, some of those services have had prayer components to them, but it's always, always, always been intended as a war memorial. That doesn't make it secular. That doesn't make it okay. But its primary purpose is to further a secular aim, if you will, to commemorate soldiers. Whereas the Pensacola Cross has always been a religious holy object that's used for annual Easter sunrise services. It's a lot newer. It was put up in a park in the 70s, early 70s. It is every year used exclusively for Christian purposes. It has no other purpose. There's no other sort of context that surrounds it that negates this overwhelming religious meaning. So from the standpoint of how Bladensburg impacts this, it's just, you can't. And so although we are, there's absolutely no reason we should lose this case, this Pensacola Cross case. We are extremely anxious because we know the judges that were on our case don't want to see us win, and they will look for any avenue to rule that this cross is allowed. So we're just kind of on pins and needles, waiting to see what kind of legal gymnastics happens to rule against us. And I'd like to think that's not going to happen, but I'm just a little pessimistic these days about the court system.
I can understand as we watch these things come through and into the news. And what strikes me, I think, is as different as these cases all seem to be, whether it's Ten Commandments monuments or crosses or invocations before government meetings, we're seeing this tactic of an appeal to tradition,
right?
That's working, and it just blows my mind.
Yeah. Well, especially because the tradition is very exclusive and leaves out lots of people, but it's also just, it's sort of anti-constitutional. There's no reason to harken back. The Constitution isn't a statute. It's not set in any particular time. It's very aspirational. It's very sort of these are the goals for our country. It's not what we wrote today and exactly the conditions of today must apply tomorrow. That just is not the point of the Constitution. That's not a point of any Constitution. That's a point of maybe a statute that changes and can be amended. This is it's
Yeah, and of course we've talked a lot about. I did a presentation in Orlando back in April on Project Blitz, which is the legislative effort sort of enshrine Christian nationalism into state law, and their playbook is just stuffed with this appeal to tradition stuff, this trying to sell that fake narrative of a Christian nation that Andrew Seidel's working so hard to correct. And so we're seeing that in the legislative, and now we're starting to see the judiciary sort of lean towards that that appeal to tradition. And yes, it's extremely frustrating because prayer before legislative meetings is okay because we've been doing it for a long time.
Right.
Doesn't seem like a really strong argument.
Well, and especially when you consider the fact that Thomas Jefferson and later Madison both denounced the practice as being violative of the First Amendment, came out of the author's mouths themselves. And so it's like the Supreme Court just completely they do a couple things in both of Greece and Marsh, but they basically say, well, Madison did it during his term or whatever. But it's like the point is, like, who cares what the founders did? It's what they said. It's what they, espoused. It's what our conditions are today. But yes, it is troubling. But I will say that Bladensburg, there was an opportunity for the Supreme Court to go that route, and it didn't.
Yeah.
Our opponents, yes, they rely on the fact that this particular cross was old, but it wasn't because it's consistent with this sort of heritage and tradition that our opponents, the American Legion, was putting forward. Alito and a couple other justices wanted that to be the test, but that failed to garner a majority, fortunately. So the rationale with the 100-year thing was really just to say that, well, it's sort of been secularized by time. People don't see it as a religious symbol as much as they see it as a secular, historic war memorial. And I'm like, yeah, but it still is it's still a war memorial. It's just a cross.
Right.
But I'm just saying, I guess at least the rationale wasn't because it's consistent with our heritage and culture, aka a Christian nation that never really existed.
Right.
So I'm glad that wasn't how far they went.
It seems, and this is just maybe a social commentary. You don't have to comment if there's nothing legal to it. But that sort of appeal to tradition, that it's permeating little bits of everything. And it doesn't speak to me, and I think that puts me sort of in one camp or one side of the fence than the other, where I really don't care what the framers thought or wrote or said.
Right.
Where are we today, and what's the best thing for our nation right now? And you know what I mean? Like, if you could imagine this wild, crazy scenario where we rip all the documents up and start over writing them from scratch. The conversation that I would like to have with those folks is, should we include church-state separation back into those documents, and at what levels, and how detailed, and how would you, like that?
Right.
That's the sort of conversation that I would like to have, rather than the tradition appeal. But that's
no, I mean, it's completely right, because it's almost like looking at the founders as if they're deities. It's like because they said so, it is the law. And it's kind of like, without asking the why, like, why do we care what Hamilton thought or Madison thought or Jefferson thought when we have a totally different world than they had? And we have our own thoughts and ideas too. And they didn't even have public school back then. So it's like there's things that just didn't, concepts that were in, unforeseeable to them that we're dealing with now, that I think the Establishment Clause had been for many years appropriately broadly interpreted to encompass all these different areas. And this humongous effort to retract that into some corner is really disturbing. Yeah.
Well, before I let you go, there's really only one specific question I wanted to ask about Bladensburg, and you kind of touched on this a little earlier. But so we started the show today with my friend Notorious RBG. Everyone should buy an action figure of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I think they're great. I don't make any money off the sale of them, but they're pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So SCOTUS blog reported in the 2017-18 term, only 12% of appearances at oral argument were women, which is like a 6 or 7 year low. So there you were, standing before the justices of the Supreme Court, in a way representing women in law. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who spent, the 70s fighting against gender discrimination, and she's become a pop culture icon. She has an action figure, for crying out loud. Was there a moment, did you have that sort of surreal moment where you just looked around and was like, holy shit, what is my life right now?
Yes, I did. And also because I was going up against three, not just any men, but it was like Neil Katyal, who had argued I don't even know how many cases, dozens and dozens of Supreme Court cases, and the U.S. Deputy Attorney General and someone from Jones, like a partner, the main partner from Jones Day, or I mean, these were big, heavy-hitting men that I was going up against. So I'm sitting there like, it's almost like, should I be here? But then the sort of, I guess, the feminist moment for me was that there had been in the row behind me a row of women, and I don't know if they just happened to be sitting next to each other, but they were all there to be sworn in, because you can become a member of the Supreme Court bar. It's actually not terribly difficult. And they were all there from sort of different walks of life, but I think 4 of them were in sort of military uniform, and I think they were probably going to be like JAG attorneys or whatnot. And it took a while for me to kind of pack up my bag before I left the courtroom, and they were all kind of like standing there, like waiting for me, and then they each individually like shook my hand and like told me how inspiring that was to watch another female. And like someone found my email address later and messaged me, and she said, I'm someone that's very religious. I wouldn't have actually otherwise been on your side of that case, but having watched you, you convinced me not only of your position, but made me feel like someday that could be me.
Wow.
And it was just like, I mean, I was in tears. I was like, oh my gosh, like, that's so amazing. And she's like, you probably don't remember me. I was sitting behind you. I'm like, I remember, like, that was super memorable to me, because I felt like that kind of made me feel like, oh, that was a big deal that I am a woman and argued in front of the Supreme Court, because these women are standing there telling me, that was a big deal to them. So yeah, that was probably like one of the highlights, I guess, of the experience.
That's some serious goosebump moments. That's awesome. Wow. Well, there are a lot of questions that follow the Bladensburg ruling. What are the implications from these interpretations that give a pass to obviously religious symbols and traditions just because they're kind of old? Is the limit test dead? What does this all mean for the future of actual religious liberty? Find out at Free Flow, November 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 2019 at the Holiday Inn, Orlando International Airport, freeflow.org. Monica, thank you so much for giving us some time today, and I can't wait to see you at Free Flow.
Yeah, you too.
All right. Monica Miller, a legal director and senior counsel with the American Humanist Association. And again, she'll be speaking at Free Flow in the first weekend in November. Free Flow is a retro theme this year. So Friday night, we've got the Cocktails and Costumes kickoff party. That took some practicing to get right, too. Saturday night, we've got a dinner with comedian Devin Siebold and the Orlando Gay Chorus performing. And, of course, Saturday and Sunday, we have speakers and workshops during the day and exhibitors set out throughout. So go to freeflow, freeflo.org right now to register. If you'd like to learn more about the atheist community of Polk County, you can go to polkatheists.org and or look us up on social media. We do social meetups and educational speakers, and every other weekend we get together and clean up our Adopter Road section of Old Dixie Highway in Auburndale. We'd be happy to have you join us at any of these. As long as you're there with good intent, we'd be happy to see you. Next week on Freethought in Florida, we have Dr. Ryan Cragen, who's another Free Flow speaker, scheduled to join us. So like and subscribe on YouTube, and we'll see you next week.